Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event recognizing #Safe Day. So Thursday, April 28th was the day, what was it? World Day for Health and Safety at Work. And we thought that that would be a great time to talk about the ILO's, the International Labor Organization's Convention 190 on the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work, as well as Recommendation 206. And there's no one better to have for this conversation than Ardra Manasi, who we're really lucky to have with us here today. She is joining us from the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and she'll share a little bit about herself. But throughout this session, Khadisha and I are here from Equality Bahamas. We'll be asking a few questions about the convention, about the recommendation, how they work, and what we can do to get them implemented. But of course, as always, we're going to start off with, what are we talking about? What is C190? What is R206? But before we dive in, I'm inviting Ardra to please introduce herself and tell us whatever we need to know about her to contextualize this conversation.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for having me here. Hi, everyone. I'm Ardra Manasi. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for Advocacy and Partnerships at Center for Women's Global Leadership. And my work currently focuses on gender, labor, and human rights, including the advocacy around ILO Convention 190.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And we know that CWGL has been doing a lot of work around C190, particularly in recent years, including with the 16 days campaign, bringing it to light and making sure that people know more about it. And so now I'm going to hand over to Khadisha for our first question.
Hi, Ardra. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning or today. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about C190 for those that may be unfamiliar.
Sure. Thanks, Khadisha. C190 is the first international treaty to address violence and harassment in the world of work. And it was adopted in June 2019 by the UN agency ILO. And what is very seminal about this convention is that it acknowledges that violence and harassment in the world of work is a human rights violation. And I think, responding to your question, maybe we can just get in more details into some of the basic definitions about the convention, in case some of you in the audience are new to this convention. So I prepared some slides and maybe we can just quickly walk through it. Yeah, so talking about this convention, I think it is very important to remember that the formulation of this convention, we are talking about when it was adopted in 2019, the process behind this was it through this social dialogue where ILO consulted governments, then workers' organizations, and also employers. So these three groups were consulted during the formulation, and as you will see through in some of the definitions, the lived realities of workers are being reflected in many of these. So yes, it was informed by a social dialogue. Yes, talking about violence and harassment, the definition within C190, again, it's a very comprehensive definition about what constitutes violence and harassment. For instance, it talks about a range of unacceptable behaviors and threats, and that includes physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm. So you can see that it's a very comprehensive definition. And in some cases, we know some of our allies have been documenting economic harm, for instance, salary cuts, or denial of gratuity to workers and so on. So that's even interesting that economic harm is included within this very broad definition. So this is violence and harassment definition wise. Then world of work. So the convention, I think this is one of my favorite, I keep saying that it's one of my favorite parts about the convention. It uses the word world of work. We are not talking about the workplace here. So yes, this includes both public and private spaces. For instance, if you're thinking about a street vendor, her workplace technically is the public space. So yes, it covers both public and private spaces. Then it talks about places where the worker is paid, takes a rest break or a meal, or uses sanitary washing and changing facilities. So that's included as world of work. Then during work-related trips, travel, training, events, or social activities. That's included under world of work. Then through work-related communications, including those enabled by information and communication technologies. And I think that's very crucial because, in the wake of COVID, we are really talking about a hybrid modes of working and telecommuting and all of that. So I think that's very significant in that context. Then in employer provided accommodation, that is counted as world of work. And lastly, when commuting to and fro from work. So many workers face harassment during their commute, and that is included in within the world of work as well. So this is broadly about that definition. Then another seminal definition is again is that of a worker. So according to this convention, worker includes persons who are working irrespective of their contractual status. And I think that's very crucial here because that includes both formal and informal sectors. And as many of you might be aware, in the informal sector, when we are talking about the informal sectors, many workers are excluded from national labor protection laws, social and legal protections. But this convention provides, safeguards for both formal and informal sectors. So that's interesting to see within the definition about what constitutes a worker. Then persons in training, including interns and apprentices. So that's covered under this convention as a worker. Then volunteers, job seekers, and job applicants. Workers whose employment has been terminated. Then individuals exercising the authority, duties or responsibilities of an employer. So again, you can see this very broad and comprehensive definition about what constitutes a worker. So that's yet again one of the features of this convention. And this is something we've been focusing at Center for Women's Global Leadership. And this convention really talks about how domestic violence, that is violence which is happening in the private sphere, is also a workplace issue. And according to this convention, it affects a woman's productivity, safety, health, and so on. So I think it really makes a connection. And last year in 2021, through Global 16 Days campaign, which is coordinated by Center for Women's Global Leadership, we actually focused on this theme last year. And we also released an advocacy guide. So maybe in case the Equality Bahamas team can share it with you on Facebook, some of these resources from CWGL. But yeah, domestic violence is a workplace issue according to this convention. So I just wanted to touch upon this feature of the convention as well. Then it really makes the connection between discrimination and gender-based violence. And the convention clearly states that there are women and girls are disproportionately impacted by violence and harassment in the world of work, and they face many kinds of discrimination. So that's acknowledged. And it also talks about other groups facing intersecting forms of discrimination. And we'll come to that shortly. For instance, vulnerable groups. So it talks about groups in situations of vulnerability. And I also want to mention here that ILO Convention 190 comes with a piece called Recommendation 206. And that provides a guidelines for implementing this convention. Again, we can get into more details later on. But so R206 is a very crucial instrument, and it's not legally binding like the ILO convention. So by legally binding, I mean that once it is ratified by countries, they're bound to put in place laws, policies, and regulations to address violence and harassment in the world of work. So, but R206 is more like a guideline to implement C190. So again, coming back to this point about vulnerable groups, R206 says that vulnerable groups, the reference in the ILO convention, can be interpreted according to various international human rights instruments and also labor standards. And at CWGL, we kind of define vulnerable groups or groups in situations of vulnerability as groups including workers with disabilities, workers belonging to LGBTQ+I communities, then migrant workers, then indigenous workers, then racial and ethnic minority workers, and so on. And also, I think workers with the condition HIV/AIDS. So this is how we kind of interpret it. But the convention clearly talks about vulnerable populations or groups in situations of vulnerability. So that's yet again another feature of this convention. And then, yeah, lastly, I need to we can get into the details again later on, but I want to quickly touch upon the solutions and actions which are prescribed within this convention, especially for governments and employers. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a legally binding convention. So it's a great tool to hold governments accountable. So in terms of solutions, especially from the side of governments, it talks about putting in place workplace policies, like national policies to address violence and harassment. Then it talks about remedies and support to the victims and survivors of GBV. That's something else, which is discussed as duties of the government. Then strengthening enforcement and monitoring. Yes, of course, it's important to put in place workplace policies, but what about enforcement and monitoring? That's yet another responsibility listed. And lastly, investigation of cases of GBV is another, duty listed for the governments. Yes, and quickly about employers as well. Yes, it talks about duties and responsibilities of an employer, which includes setting up workplace policies in consultations with workers. And that includes maybe taking into account risk assessments within the workplace to understand what are the risks faced by the workers and occupational safety and health. The ILO convention clearly states that violence and harassment can be integrated into occupational safety and health. And I think we're having this discussion in the backdrop of Safe Day, and I think it's very crucial to make that connection, and providing training to workers and other persons concerned and so on. So yes, putting in place workplace policies is one of the major tasks that employers can take up. But I think it's kind of very brief, but these are mainly some of the seminal features of this convention. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's really insightful. I can see now why CWGL is focusing so much on it. I think that was really great.
Thank you, Ardra. So just a follow-up question to that. Can you talk to us a little bit about why a convention specific to violence and harassment in the world of work is critical to tackling femicide and domestic violence?
Definitely. So as I already mentioned, this is the first international treaty to address violence and harassment in the world of work. And before June 2019, we didn't really have an international treaty in place. And of course, there are some countries which has very effective laws against it, but there are also countries with laws, but on the implementation side, they might not be doing great. So I think having an international convention really addresses some of this gaps in terms of existing national legislations. So this is a great framework that countries can really take it up. And I think we need to remember that the convention really talks about the fact that gender-based violence in the world of work is unacceptable. And I think that is one of the main contributions of this convention. And talking about GBV in the world of work, this also looks at both, we have seen some of the definitions. It covers both formal and informal sectors. And we have seen how in the informal sectors, for instance, in 2020, the Global 16 Days campaign, again, coordinated by CWGL, we focused on the issues faced by informal women workers. And we are talking about 740 million informal women workers around the world severely impacted by COVID-19. And we really focused on 6 sectors at that point. For instance, domestic workers, sex workers, agricultural workers, waste pickers, and so on. So yeah, coming back to the point about this convention really covers both formal and informal sectors. And mostly, in many cases, what we see is women workers, especially from informal sectors, are excluded from national laws or social and legal protections. So I think this convention really acknowledges their contribution as well as offers protection to them. I think that's, again, it's very crucial to have that aspect. And again, going back to your question about why we need a convention, I think we need to also think about what is the cost of gender-based violence in the world of work. For instance, the cost can be at an individual level, where we're really talking about mental and physical well-being of an individual or a worker is affected. Then the family is impacted, the whole community is impacted. Then even the work and worker relations are impacted, productivity is impacted. So it has all these spillover effects, and it has a huge cost. So I think we really need to address violence and harassment in the world of work for these reasons, and also take a very gender responsive approach. And I think that is, again, one of the successes of having an international human rights instrument to address this, because a gender responsive approach presupposes that like the convention states, women and girls are disproportionately impacted by violence and harassment in the world of work. And this can be due to unequal, power relations or gender stereotypes they are facing. So there is a clear connection between discrimination and violence and harassment. So I think having an international instrument make that connection is very crucial. And lastly, I know you did mention about femicide as well. That's an issue we've been, again, through CWGL. It was our 30th anniversary last year. So for that, we really focused on the theme of femicide, or ending, gender-related killing of women and girls. And last year, we were also talking about femicide in the world of work. Of course, femicide can occur both in private as well as public spheres. For instance, private sphere is something like domestic violence leading to femicides. But femicides in the world of work constitutes, femicides in the public sphere, where workers, for instance, workers in precarious working conditions, say sex workers and domestic workers, are being murdered. So yes, it's a very serious and crucial issue to be addressed. And I think this convention really provides a great tool to actually address it. So if gender-based violence is unaddressed in the world of work, is unaddressed, it can actually spiral into femicides. So I think that's where we really need this international treaty to address it. Yeah.
So I think we're getting to the point where we're understanding the importance of C190 and why we need to get it ratified, but I think we get stuck on the how. What does it take to actually get ILO Convention 190 ratified? Like, what should advocates and NGOs be doing? Are there other people that should be doing more to get ratification by countries?
That's a great question. Thanks, Alicia. And recently I was at this event, multi-country virtual forum focusing on C190, which CWGL co-hosted with some of our allies like ActionAid and others. And an interesting update that I heard there was there are like 80 countries currently where lobbying around this convention is taking place. And I think that's very heartening to hear. So hopefully we'll have more countries ratify it. And currently 12 countries have ratified the convention. Going back to your question, I think the quick answer, the simple answer is that we need political will to ratify this convention. And the question is, how do you actually achieve that political will? And I think I would say, especially for civil society organizations and like other advocates, I think it's very crucial to build alliances. So alliance building is a first and the most important step towards a ratification campaign, we can say. And by alliance building, I mean, it's important to identify who are the targets. So the targets can be your government or employers. And who are your allies? For instance, your allies can be trade unions. Your allies can be faith-based organizations. Your allies can be women's rights organization, academia, or organizations working with certain groups. We have seen certain groups facing intersecting forms of discrimination, say an organization working with women workers with disability or LGBTQ+I communities. So all these can be your allies. So I think it's important for civil society organization to identify targets as well as allies. And maybe it's also useful to kind of assess the current national policy scene. For instance, again, this is actually one of the recommendations provided by ITUC, that it's a legal step where maybe trade unions can actually advocate to set up a commission to identify the existing gaps in policies on sexual harassment laws in the country. So if you identify the specific gaps, it's easier to convince your government, you need to address such and such things. So I think that can be a very crucial step. And you can advocate for that. You can really work with trade unions and other organizations, maybe a national commission to really do an inquiry into existing laws. And for one of the countries which ratified it, Uruguay had very supportive policies already in place. So, that can really help in many cases. And the other, I think the other kind of component I can think of is social dialogue. I think I mentioned it before in one of the slides we were talking about. I think it's very important to have the buy-in of these three parties, which is the government, employers, and workers' organizations, as identified by ILO. So yes, if you're like really launching a ratification campaign on the ground, yes, make sure that you have the buy-in from all these groups. I think that's very crucial. And each country, I mean, I think we can't think about one size fits all model here. So each country, each context is very different. So I think if you're looking at a campaign, it has to be tailored to specific needs. Which are the sectors facing, the most violence and harassment? Which are the sectors being impacted by COVID-19 and so on? So I think it has to be a very like context specific approach. And maybe like if I can think about three main steps, especially based on what we have seen. And currently, I also briefly want to mention that we launched a national campaign in Nepal in partnership with Forum for Women, Law and Development, FWLD. That was in 2021 March. And it's a national coalition of civil society organizations, which is led by FWLD, to call on the government of Nepal to ratify this convention. So whatever lessons I'm sharing here is mainly based on what I've seen in that context as well. And what has really worked is, first of all, conducting a research and collecting evidence, and it can be worker testimonies and so on, about what are the issues faced by workers in that country or in a particular sector and so on. And the next step can be awareness building, which is mainly working with, say, organizing events like these, or using social media to create awareness, using advocacy resources and so on. So the next step is awareness building. And the third step is advocacy and lobbying. And that's where you really need to meet with your parliamentarians, your ministries, your trade unions, and so on, especially as I mentioned about identifying certain allies and so on. So I think all these components, I've seen this make an impact. And I think it's also important to remember that ultimately we want ratifications. That's the ultimate journey. But at the same time, we see it at CWGL, we see this capacity building process is in itself, itself is great, because it might take maybe 3 years for a ratification campaign and to make that country ratified. But still, the process for that civil society organization, where you're continuously building alliances, you're continuously meeting with different actors, groups. So I think that in itself is, I would say it's one of the successes. I would see that as a success too. Yeah.
And as you were talking, I just took a peek at the ILO website to see what those 12 countries are, because I know the last time we had this conversation, I think there were 7 countries. So it seems like things are moving along, although, we'd like to see over 100 countries there. Up to 12, almost double is pretty good. But I noticed that only, I think 5 of them say that it's currently in force. And a number of them say not in force, but have a note that it will enter into force on a particular date. And it looks to be generally a year after the convention is ratified. Is that something that's built into the convention, that you ratify and you have a year to sort of get your stuff together and make things work? Or what's happening there?
I think it has to do with the technicality again, and that's mentioned. Once you ratify it, it takes a certain time period for it to come into force. So that's built into the system. But it's an interesting question, because I know that South Africa ratified it. And again, I heard this at another event the other day, that still the trade unions there, despite ratifications, they're fighting for something there, which is incorporating the word world of work within the existing labor, codes and so on. So still they keep using workplace. So yes, as you said, maybe that time period really helps by the time, again, for a social dialogue to happen maybe, and make sure that all the national laws align with the provisions of C190.
Yeah, because as we've seen with other conventions like CEDAW, like ratification doesn't mean that things magically change. It actually has to be domesticated. You have to make some changes to legislation, and in many cases to constitutions. So maybe that's kind of built in for states to be able to make that transition. So that's interesting.
Ardra, I'm curious if you can share some of the successes you've seen so far. I know you mentioned a few countries that have ratified. Maybe you have some unique stories that, are interesting to share.
Definitely. Thanks, Kadesha. Yes, in terms of ratifications, 12 countries, that's great. And we're talking about like pandemic years. And again, it's very heartening to see the kind of coalition building around C190, despite all the challenges. So that's interesting to see. But at the same time, I really want to like mention something here. Ultimately, again, we want countries to ratify it, but we don't really need to wait for ratification to start using the provisions of C190 and recommendation 206. So that's something I want to really emphasize here. And I see success, your question about success, more in terms of course, ratifications on one side, but also how can we implement this convention even before its ratification? And yes, I can think of very successful examples here. One is like lately, like very recently, like earlier this month, April 1st, a landmark agreement for garment workers was signed, holding the global fashion brand H&M accountable. So this campaign, just to give you some of the background about this campaign, it was called Justice for Jayashree campaign. And that was led by some of our allies, Global Labor Justice, ILRF, then Asia Floor Wage Alliance, and a trade union in South India, TTCU. So they finally managed to hold this fashion giant, H&M, accountable through an enforceable agreement, providing protection for 5,000 garment workers in Tamil Nadu, which is in South India. And that was huge because, and they used C190 provision, they integrated C190 provisions into that agreement called Dindigul Agreement, which was signed between the parties. And it provides protection, as I said, for 5,000 garment workers. And they really use the definition. We have seen some of the definitions earlier. And they use the definition about violence and harassment, very broad definition, physical, sexual, economic harm, etc. They integrated that into the convention, integrated that into the agreement. So that is another example to use the convention even before its ratification. And this Justice for Jayashree movement was really like inspired by the murder of a garment worker in South India. And she was murdered after months of harassment by her male supervisor. So, and that, I mean, that was a very gruesome murder, and her trade union, which was TTCU, they decided to join hands with their partners that I mentioned earlier, Global Labor Justice, ILRF, and Asia Floor Wage Alliance, and other labor rights and women's rights organizations around the world to really demand accountability from this fashion brand. Because Jayashree Kadiravel, the 21-year-old garment worker who was murdered, she was working for Eastman Exports, a company which was in turn supplying, clothes to H&M. So you can also see the connection where there are global supply chains, and these women workers are largely invisible to these large global fashion brands. So yeah, I just wanted to talk more about that campaign, because I mean, it's a landmark victory achieved on April 1st, 2022. So that is one of the successes, recent successes that I can think of. And some of the other examples are, as I mentioned, Nepal. So currently our campaign to ratify, I mean, calling on the government of Nepal to ratify the convention is ongoing. And as I mentioned, they've been working, it was very interesting to see how they've been working with multi-stakeholders. And that includes journalists, they're working with parliamentarians, they're working with different ministries, hosting virtual policy dialogues with each group. And they're also using this national coalition to really draw the attention to existing laws on harassment and violence in Nepal, and calling for their better implementation. So that is another way to use C190 provisions. Yes, the coalition has been using it to call for better implementation of existing laws. So that is another example of using it. And again, if I can think of another example from Nepal, there is this group called Media Advocacy Group, MAG, and they work with me on media and advocacy. And MAG has been currently working on integrating C190 and R206 into a code of ethics, or a code of conduct for media entities. So that's yet another way to use it even before ratification. Yeah, I think these are some of the examples that I can think of. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I remember hearing about that H&M story a while back, but I don't think like many folks make that immediate connection between, things like this and what's actually happening out there in like the world of work. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Ardra, so you just talked a little bit about how C190 can be implemented. And I know you discussed earlier recommendation 206. So can you just talk to us a little bit about that more in depth as it relates to, guidelines that organizations and governments can use to implement this and operationalize it?
Definitely. Thanks, Lauren, for that question. And I think I'll just start with where I ended for the last question, which is, yes, ratification is crucial, but also implementation before ratification. That's something we've been advocating for both through our campaigns. And I think it's important to remember that C190 can be used in conjunction with other international human rights instruments. For instance, CEDAW. Now, Alicia brought up CEDAW. And I know Bahamas, Equality Bahamas has been hosting these series of conversations on CEDAW as well, which is great. So yes, if countries have already ratified CEDAW, you can definitely go to your government, with working on the advocacy efforts and say that, this is another convention. And CEDAW talks about non-discrimination and equality, some of the same principles enshrined in C190 as well. So yes, one way to use it is in conjunction with other international human rights instruments already ratified by your government. That is another way. And yes, your question about operationalizing these articles within the convention, and R206 comes as mainly like a primer for implementation, if we want to call it that. And it really lays down clear guidelines on how some of these provisions, some of the definitions that we saw earlier, world of work or violence and harassment, a comprehensive definition, vulnerable populations, etc., can be really implemented in practice. And I can actually give few examples, and I have R206 here, so I can maybe just share a few examples here. For instance, I think we did discuss earlier what are the actions and solutions that employers can take up. And one of them was setting up workplace policies. And R206 has clear guidelines on how that, or what can go into such workplace policies. For instance, section 7 of it, I can just maybe read out some of the provisions. It really provides a template. For instance, if any organization wants to just adapt that language and use it, I think that would be great. For instance, it talks about section 7 of this R206. It talks about workplace policies where it state that violence and harassment will not be tolerated. Establish violence and harassment prevention programs with appropriate measurable objectives. Specify the rights and responsibilities of the worker and the employer. Then it should contain information on complaint and investigation procedures. Then it should provide all internal and external communication related to incidents of violence and harassment. It should specify the right to privacy of individuals and confidentiality, as referred to in Article 10 of the Convention. And it should include measures to protect complainants, victims, witnesses, and whistleblowers against victimization or retaliation. So you can see all these provisions. These are guidelines in R206 to implement what we discussed earlier. How can employers come up with a workplace policy? So that's one example, and I can maybe talk about more examples. We were talking about vulnerable groups earlier, or groups in situations of vulnerability. And again, R206 goes into specifies some of the sectors, occupations facing heightened forms of vulnerability. For instance, R206 talks about night work, work in isolation, health, hospitality, social services, emergency services, domestic work, transport, education, or entertainment. So these are some of the sectors which might need, special care and attention because of intersecting forms of discrimination or because of the nature of working conditions, worker relations, and so on. And then it also talks about protecting migrant workers, particularly women migrant workers. And also it talks about women workers from informal economy. So again, these are guidelines to how can we better implement C190. Again, it really provides detailed guidelines here. And I also want to mention about enforcement and remedies, because I think we earlier discussed that in terms of specific actions that governments should take up. First is about prevention and protection, which is through workplace policies at the national level. Then we heard about enforcement and monitoring. Then it's about providing remedies to victims and survivors. And then lastly, providing guidance and training. So these are some of the major functions listed. for governments. And R206 clearly, again, kind of gets into more in-depth conversation on this. For instance, what does remedies constitute? For instance, remedies can mean right to resign with compensation. It can mean appropriate compensation for damages. It can mean legal fee and costs according to national laws. So it really, like, kind of fleshes out each kind of action mentioned in C190 and kind of elaborates it. So remedies, then support for victims. That's one of the functions of, again, government to set up that. And it talks about support to victims in terms of counseling and information service. 24-hour hotlines should be set up, emergency services, medical care and treatment, then specialized police units. So again, it clearly talks about how can we really operationalize and implement that particular point about remedies and support systems. And yeah, lastly, I want to quickly mention about domestic violence as well. I think that came up in our conversation earlier. And R206 clearly again outlines some of the policies that employers can take up to address domestic violence in the world of work. For instance, leave for victims of domestic violence, paid leave. It doesn't say paid leave, it says leave for victims, but there are countries like Philippines, which has really put in place a 10-day paid leave for victims of domestic violence. So there are like successful and promising practices around the world. Then flexible work arrangements and protection for victims of domestic violence. Then temporary protection against dismissal when they actually bring up the complaints. So these are some of the examples of how we can really read C190 in conjunction with R206 and also use it in conjunction with other international human rights instruments like CEDAW.
Thank you, Ardra.
All right, I think this might be the last question, but what can employees do to get employers to consider R206? Like maybe there are some day-to-day strategies that individuals can do. I know that we have a list of resources as well, but we wanted to hear from you, in your opinion, what recommendations or suggestions you may have for just everyday employees that want to really, hold their employers accountable to doing some of this work. What can they do?
Thank you, Kadesh. I think that's a great question. I think the first step is to raise awareness about this convention, and also we have seen some of the provisions of R206. So within workers, among workers, how do you raise awareness? And sometimes in local context, it's good to translate some of these materials into your local languages so that more workers can be, especially from the informal sectors and so on, can be informed. And we have seen such campaigns happening at the grassroots level where they've been translating some of these materials into local languages. I think we have just kind of compiled a few resources from CWGL. So it would be great if the Equality Bahamas team can share it on Facebook so that, some of us in the audience can use it. And coming back to your question, I think, yes, it's about raising awareness. And if you're part of a trade union, maybe it's worth exploring, or it's great to work with trade unions to bring up this issue with your employer. ILO Convention 190 clearly talks about the right to collective bargaining. So that is yet another way to incorporate provisions of C190 and R206. For instance, a collective bargaining agreement, that's usually a written agreement which is signed between workers on behalf, like between a trade union and an employer on behalf of workers. So CBAs are very interesting tools, collective bargaining agreements where you can really incorporate provisions of C190 into these agreements. And even otherwise, you can maybe do an assessment about the current, as employees, you can do an assessment about the current workplace policies in place, or even current occupational safety and health policies in place. And you can just ask questions like, is violence and harassment covered under that? Is world of work included, or is it just talking about workplace? Or you can ask questions like, is gender integrated into that framework? So I think even with it depends on like maybe doing a current assessment of existing workplace policies and asking all these questions in the framework of C190 and R206, and then raising awareness. And if it's a particular sector, I think you might want to like gather evidence from workers through testimonies. What are the forms of violence they faced by domestic workers? Has COVID really made an impact? So these are some of the useful questions you can keep asking. And I did mention working through unions and collective bargaining agreements, then using occupational safety and health as a hook, because C190 again clearly states that violence and harassment can be integrated into occupational health and safety, non-discrimination laws, then equality and other criminal laws when it's in the context of national frameworks. So yes, if you have workplace policies already in place, looking at all of this, this is a time to maybe start integrating C190 and R206 provisions, be it the definitions, be it the use of the word, groups facing multiple intersecting forms of discrimination and so on. We have seen the definitions. I'm not going over it again. So I think that's a useful, maybe the first step to start working with employers.
Thank you. I like that. Those, I think, yeah, those are definitely useful, and they can be applicable to various forms of work. So I really like those.
Ardra, do you have any ideas about how C190 or R206 can work for informal workers? I'm thinking particularly about domestic workers who have sort of an individual or a family who is their employer. How can it be used in those cases?
Yeah, sure, Alicia. Yes, as mentioned earlier, C190 really applies to workers irrespective of their contractual status. And that includes workers from both formal and informal sectors. And as we have seen in many contexts, domestic workers, especially migrant domestic workers, they really face like multiple forms of vulnerability because of their migrant status. And as you mentioned rightly, their world of work is that private space, which is the employer's home or the household. And C190, again, it applies to both private and public spaces. So I think it's great that we can use some of these provisions directly from the convention, which is applicable to domestic workers. And what, we have seen, for instance, there is this organization, Sandigan Kuwait, in Kuwait, and they work with migrant domestic workers in Kuwait. And it's great to see Anna Bunda. She's one of the leaders of the organization, and she was herself a domestic worker too. And what they've done is, of course, they've been for years working on advocacy around C189, which is Domestic Workers Convention 189. And yeah, she was recently talking about some of the lessons learned from that. So yes, in many cases, they're not in a power to advocate. They don't have the agency as domestic workers to advocate for some of these rights. So again, what really worked in that context was building alliances. So with lawyers, organizations, civil society organizations, and so on. And finally, they actually managed to get the domestic workers law promulgated in Kuwait, and that was in 2015. With its sustained advocacy and campaigns. So yes, I think domestic workers hopefully can use C190 in a similar way as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be really helpful to have maybe a website or somewhere that we can go to see some of the successes that aren't limited to ratification of C190, because there are other successes, right? Like the one that you mentioned about the H&M case, because within different contexts, it looks different. So for example, in the Bahamas, where we're looking at domestic workers being able to come together to push for something like this, it's harder if most domestic workers aren't Bahamian. So they're already, multiple forms of discrimination and having to get through all of these different barriers, because the attitude generally is, well, if you don't like it, then you should just leave. But this is where people have come to work. This is where they've made their homes. This is where they've built families. So there has to be a way for them to be able to work together. And I think that your point about joining with civil society organizations and labor organizations is really important, because that's where you're able to actually build power, and working with organizations and people that already have some of those relationships and ties that are, I don't know, more recognized, even though they're no more legitimate, but they're more recognized.
I think, thank you, Alicia. I think that's a great suggestion, and maybe I'll discuss it with my team, and hopefully we can take it up, maybe at least a section to highlight some of and document some of the successes from around the world. And recently we've also been like in trying to conduct more C190 related trainings. So maybe that can actually be a component of it, sharing promising practices as well. So, but thank you for that suggestion, definitely noted.
And for those who are wondering what we're talking about, we keep referencing CWGL resources. So we've put together a public Google Doc where you can access all of the links to the different advocacy guides and other resources that Center for Women's Global Leadership has put together. And you can access them at tiny.cc/CWGL resources. So that's where you can go to get all of the links, tiny.cc/CWGL resources. Does anybody else have any other questions before we wrap this session up? No other questions. I'm checking Facebook to see if anyone's asked anything over there. Doesn't look so. So I guess, Ardra, that looks like you've been very comprehensive and or given people a lot to think about for next time. Because we'll be calling on you again. And we're really looking forward to continuing the work on C190 and R206 and making it more familiar to people, because I think it's really important for people to understand what these conventions are and how they relate to personal lives. Because if they're just documents, they're just something that somebody in some big organization made, it's easy to brush off. But when you actually can make connections and understand how people's real lives are built and how they can be affected by these documents and by these conventions and agreements and commitments that the government needs to make, we're better able to mobilize and to build that political will that we need. I think we get this idea that it starts at the top, but it really starts with us, the people. Like, we have to say what we want, we have to demand it, and we have to make it irresistible, right? To people in positions of power and people who want to be in those positions. So thank you so much, Ardra, for coming and making this more real for us. I always appreciate, especially the definitions and the talking about what the world of work really means. Who is a worker? We don't talk about these things enough in general. So it's really important to focus on it when we're talking about violence, harassment, discrimination in the world of work and beyond. So thank you again for being here with us on a Saturday morning, no less. Next time we'll find a more, work appropriate day and time to meet. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Lauren and Khadijah, for joining in this session and asking some really great questions.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you, Khadijah and Lauren as well, for having me here. And it's always good to come back to like Equality Bahamas for like different conversations. And thank you for all your amazing work as well in the Caribbean region. So and leading like important conversations around gender equality. So thank you for that as well. And hopefully our audience will find some of these resources helpful in your advocacy with different groups, be it governments, trade unions, civil society organizations, and so on. And yes, it's a great tool for both labor rights and women's rights movements to come together and also demand accountability from government, because it's a legally binding tool. I think we need to remember that. And yeah, as I mentioned, we can start using the provisions. We don't need to wait for ratification. And that in itself is a huge success if we start using these provisions. So thank you, everyone.
That's a great point that you just made at the end there, Ardra. We don't have to wait for ratification. We can actually push for some of these things to be implemented at the workplace, so the level of the workplace, and not just wait for the government to mandate it. For those joining and who are following Equality Bahamas or want to, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're at Equality242, and our next event is Wednesday, May 4th. We will have bystander intervention training with Lauren Glinton, and I will also be in conversation with Marian Bethel about Equality Bahamas Strike 5 campaign to criminalize marital rape. We'll be walking through the demands that we have for amendments to the Sexual Offences Act and why we've made these specific demands and why they're important and how they impact people's real lives. So please join us for that session. It starts at 6:30 and you can register at tiny.cc/WW May 4. See you then.